Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. Even back in the early days of gaming, it was often hoped for that a good game would get a sequel, so let's see what people thought made a good one by looking at Descent 2. The original Descent came out at a time when every first-person shooter was trying to beat Doom, and while most of them tried this by adding a different coat of paint, Descent took a step toward innovating the genre. The end result was the 6 Degrees of Freedom subgenre, where you pilot a ship that can move in every possible direction. What made this special was because this was back in the days of the classic FPS, when the maze-like level design was more important than the story, and since you could now move in a 3D space, that meant the levels could be far more intricate. The problem with making a sequel, however, is that you have a tenuous balancing act to maintain. You want to preserve what compelled people to love the original, but you also want to improve it so that it's not just the same as said original. How much should be changed and where that line should be drawn is a common question within the industry, and not one with an easy answer. For Descent 2, since there were very few, if any, studios doing 6 Degrees of Freedom, they opted for more of the same with overall improvements to the graphics, weaponry, enemies, and so on across the board. My question going in was whether those improvements would be enough to get past the issues that I saw with the original, so without further ado, let's dive into it. The story, in keeping with classic FPS, is virtually non-existent, so let's cover the basics. In the original, you were working as a materials defender for the PTMC, or Post-Terran Mineral Corporation, which has mining operations scattered across the galaxy. However, some kind of virus has infected the robots operating the mines, and in the original, you were tasked with purging the mines within our solar system by destroying the mines themselves. Now, contractual obligations have roped you into doing more operations, this time outside of our solar system. Your objectives are the same: destroy the reactor within each mine, get out of there before the mine self-destructs, and rescue any human hostages you find. That's pretty much what you're doing through the whole game, so let's get to the good stuff. You will hear me mention the original a lot in this review because, in many ways, it's a natural extension of it. Descent 2 was originally made as an expansion before it was fleshed out and made its own standalone release, and almost everything in the game reflects that. The first few levels ramp up in difficulty and complexity far faster than the original did, and the old weapons are found much earlier as well. Despite this, if Descent 2 is the first game you play in this series, they do offer something that can help you acclimate in the form of the Guidebot. This robot, when freed from its little cell, will help you find the colored keys that you need in order to progress, what needs to be destroyed, and the exit door once you've blown everything up. The AI driving the Guidebot is surprisingly good, despite the difficulty of navigating in a 3D space. The only time it really gave me grief was when it was using flares to light the path it was taking, which sometimes meant throwing flares directly at me. This wouldn't be a problem on its own, but the fact that doors full of angry robots have a tendency to open up behind you did make it irritating. In some ways, the Guidebot is almost essential to effectively navigate the levels, because, as mentioned earlier, the layout gets more complex a lot faster, and the map is a lot less useful than it once was. It's not that anything in particular changed about the map, but the reason the wireframe design worked before is because the game's levels were fairly straightforward, with a lot of common shapes and easily traceable paths. Here though, the levels can get massive and are overall more organic, making it more difficult to figure out where to go without the Guidebot nearby. This is especially true where finding secrets are concerned, as the Guidebot doesn't care what you're looking for apart from the main objective. Some people will enjoy that greater challenge in terms of finding everything, but since I mainly play shooters for the shooting part and overall less for the exploration, it left me feeling mostly annoyed. That's not to say that the level design is bad, however, as it is still very well done. Pretty much every level I saw was unique in some way, and because of the more organic structure, they do stand out from each other a little more than before. Things may be harder to find, but there are still plenty of secrets to find, weapons to discover, and so on. The secret levels were even more interesting in that regard as well, since they were more focused on being interesting deviations in their own right rather than a full-on level. Some of them can be a bit obtuse, but we'll get to that in a moment. The levels themselves are broken up into sets of 4, with 24 main levels in total. These sets allow for some consistency throughout, as you can always depend on 2 secret level entrances, a boss robot at the 4th level, and new robots being introduced usually within the first 2 levels. The robots and levels themselves tend to follow the same design pattern as the place you find them, especially in the final level set, which is both a blessing and a curse. It means that the robots don't stick out like a sore thumb as enemies which are just supposed to be there for the sake of something to shoot at. However, it also means it can be harder to figure out where they are, as in the final set it's pretty much nothing but green walls, green robots, and green projectiles. I do like the color green, but that doesn't mean it should be in everything. My biggest problem with the levels, beyond just my difficulty navigating them, are the fact that not everything can be accessed by just having the right key. There are also certain panels that have to be destroyed in order to enter some rooms, which I'm not sure how to react to. On one hand, it means that exploration comes down to our ability to notice the panels as well as being able to follow the map and guidebot. On the other hand, this can become a major source of frustration. They introduced the mechanic in the second level, but because they hadn't given any indication before that blasting stuff could open doors, it took me a while to figure out what to do and was a thorn in my side for much of the game. It added what I felt was an unnecessary extra layer of something to keep track of when just getting the keys and finding secret doors would have been enough. That's not even mentioning the fact that some doors will only open once after blasting a panel, and/or only for a short time afterward, which felt unnecessarily punishing. The amount it was used in the secret levels is even worse, and though I can somewhat forgive it there because you can get 2 attempts to enter said secret level, it's still obnoxious to deal with. Outside of that, having robots pop out of hidden doors once you complete certain objectives or enter a certain area is a nice idea that's used well in the original, but in this game is massively overused. As an occasional thing to keep us on our toes, it works well enough, but after a while, you learn to expect it as a rule rather than as something that's meant to take you by surprise when you don't expect it. It's the reason why some people find pure horror games to lose their luster after the first couple of hours. Eventually you see the same trick often enough to where it doesn't scare you anymore, and then the monster is a nuisance rather than a terrifying menace. Had the hidden doors been used more sparingly, they would have been great, but when it seems to happen every other time you pick up a key, it stops being interesting. Even though this can lead to some weird difficulty spikes, the game does give you plenty to work with in order to do well. As mentioned earlier, you get the old weapons back more quickly, and before long my hopes for cool advanced weapons were answered. Each weapon has an advanced or alternate version, and all of them are useful in their own way. The Helix Cannon replaces the spread fire and unloads a ton more shots per round, making it even deadlier in short-range fights. The Phoenix Cannon avoids the problem that the original Plasma Cannon had of being too similar to the lasers by bouncing off of walls, much to both my delight and dismay. Huh, what is that? Phoenix Cannon?
Oh, the Phoenix! Yeah, by the way, the projectiles bounce off walls, so be careful.
I noticed! Oh man, I
Yeah,
could get
it
such
uses a lot
awesome
of
trick
ammo,
shots
so
if I were
be
actually
careful.
good at this game. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That is awesome. I like this gun. What?!
Wow.
That didn't happen. That didn't happen. That totally didn't happen. The best part about this system is that, apart from the Phoenix Cannon and Super Laser, the new weapons don't outright replace each other. The Helix Cannon requires you to be closer than the spread fire in order to be accurate, so there is a legitimate trade-off in power, safety, and energy management that comes into play. As seen already, the Phoenix Cannon can backfire if you're too careless, and that's not going into how much energy it consumes. The best example, however, is the Gauss Cannon, which in most cases is simply more effective than the Vulcan. Not only does it keep the Vulcan's advantage of hitting almost immediately, it's more accurate, leaves quite the explosion when it lands, and doesn't burn through ammo as quickly. However, when firing through a thin grate, the Vulcan is going to do more damage in the long run because more of its bullets are going to get through than the Gauss cannons, which means there is a legitimate reason to switch back to it. Energy management is also a bigger deal due to a decent number of other things they added in. If you wanted to light up a dark room in the original, you had to throw out flares, which can tell you a bit as they travel but aren't as good for lighting large areas. Now you're also given a flashlight, which will slowly drain your energy while active, but make the area in front of you completely visible. You can also find an afterburner that will give you a huge increase in speed but can only be used for a short duration, and an energy to shield converter that can give you back some shields if you have any energy above 100. Because of both this and the increased difficulty, I found myself using my missiles far more than I did in the original, which given their variety is really good. Pretty much everything outside of the flash missile and concussion missile are radically different from each other and fulfill different niches. The guided missile, for instance, is a missile that is manually controlled, allowing you to scout ahead and take out powerful robots in relative safety. The Mercury missile is the big angry brother of the concussion missile, traveling ridiculously fast and causing quite the knockback when it lands. And then there's the Earthshaker missile, which needs no other explanation than this. Yeah, it's awesome. With the weapon variety in good shape, the enemy variety also went up quite a bit as well, even with the starting enemies. The first one you encounter is really agile, which further encourages you to either be patient or switch weapons to the Gauss so that you can guarantee the hit. There's also plenty of variety in ways that I didn't expect, such as with the melee robots. One of them occasionally fires a homing plasma shot, another one acts as an energy drain, and another is a mine layer / suicide bomber. The final one, however, is the infamous Thief Bot, which is the best and worst addition in this game. Best because it encourages you to explore the level and use your afterburner. Worst because it stole my big guns and I'm gonna catch the little brat and shoot it to smithereens to where the only evidence of its existence will be a charred spot on the wall. Man, that thing was annoying. Fortunately, though the robots have a tendency of coming out of nowhere when you complete an objective, a lot of the BS from the original wasn't all that present. I complained a lot in my review of it about the Vulcan robots, as when you get used to dodging projectiles only to run into something that can take a chunk of health from you immediately, it can be rather frustrating. Most of that nonsense is pretty much gone, as even when they give a robot the Gauss cannon, it doesn't really hurt as much as I expected. There is a robot armed with the smart missile, but the projectiles don't seem to be as eager to home in, making it easier to work around than the infamous level 7 boss fight was in the original. In fact, having the smart missile robot actually worked to the level's advantage when it was present. The smart missile, which is a straight-line missile that releases homing plasma projectiles on death, was one of the few missiles that I didn't use a whole lot. Often it was better to use a guided missile if I wanted to peek around a corner, especially since you get far more of them. However, because I knew the robot that used them would drop smart missiles, it encouraged me to use them more often, and turned out to be really useful against some of the smaller swarming robots. The weapon and enemy variety works so well with each other that you could do an entire game design lecture based on it. Add on to that well-placed audio cues that clue you in on what robots you're likely to be up against, and it's very evident that a lot of thought and effort went into the design of, well, everything. More importantly, everything is distinct, to where I never confuse the noise the Guidebot makes with any other robot. However, some of that nonsense was reintroduced with the boss fights. Originally, my complaint about the boss fights was the lack of them, but since you get one every 4 levels now, that's pretty much taken care of, and at first I thought it was great. The difficulty of them seemed to be balanced as well, as they increasingly become larger, more menacing, and overall harder to beat without dying a couple of times. Unfortunately, once I got to the level 16 boss fight, the shiny veneer had worn off. In order to increase the variety, they had given the robots different looks and weaponry, which is what you would expect. What they don't tell you is that some of these robots will have immunity to certain weapons, which they may or may not make obvious. The only reason I knew that was the case is because I went to research the level 16 boss fight after I got stuck on it. So the level 16 boss fight is immune to energy weapons, the level 20 boss fight is immune to physical weapons, and the final boss fight can only be hurt with physical weapons from behind while it's firing Earthshaker missiles at you. Sure, if you're lucky enough to avoid the Earthshaker missile, and if you're good enough to find enough of those missiles on your own to hit it from behind, it's all well and good, but if you don't, then it becomes a nightmare. My method to beat it eventually came down to rushing in, grabbing my Gauss cannon and a cloaking device, and dealing whatever damage I could to his backside before the sheer blast radius of the unaimed Earthshaker missiles killed me. Who designed this, and where do I go to shoot him? Anyway, apart from the obnoxious boss fights and other silliness I've mentioned, the game length and difficulty were overall in good shape. Bear in mind that I didn't play the game as regularly as I wanted to, which meant it was probably harder for me than it would be for others, but the default difficulty felt overall better than it did before. This is definitely a harder game than the original though, so if this is your first time in a classic FPS or 6 Degrees of Freedom game, I recommend you start out on the lowest difficulty. If you have some experience with the game, then the middle difficulty works well, and if you're feeling truly masochistic, there are 2 difficulty levels above that. If I wanted to kill myself, there are more humane ways to do it, but the challenge is there if you want it. The game length also felt more justified than the original, since that there are overall more weapons and more variety as the game went on. The theme levels meant that new stuff was being introduced all the way to the end, so even if the core gameplay loop wasn't changing a whole lot, the way in which I was interacting with it was different enough to be interesting. The graphics do look overall better and in my opinion hold up better as well. 3D models from old school gaming only seemed to work when they were being used for robots, and since the enemies are nothing but that, they look really nice. Everything is sharp, distinct, and relatively easy to spot, even in the overload of green in the last level set. It's not going to be the most amazing game you've seen, but it's not a game that you'll forget the look of either. There isn't as much music this time around, but given the massive amount the original had, it's understandable and probably for the best. Because of just how much there wasn't much that really stood out in my mind. But since I was actually listening to each track multiple times, I actually can tell you more about a specific track and pick out my favorite. It's not the kind of music that I generally enjoy, but for the aesthetic the game has, it works pretty well. Overall, I can definitely see why critics generally rated Descent 2 higher than the original. The graphical improvements are welcome, the variety is greatly increased in pretty much every regard, and almost all of the issues I had with the original were fixed. However, the later boss fights, having to worry about panels that don't show up on the map as well as the keys, and the amount that they relied on robots showing up behind you left a sour taste in my mouth. I did still have a lot of fun with it, but the amount of frustration that I also had can't be ignored. In the end, my recommendation comes down to this. Are you willing to put up with some of the old school eccentricities of the classic FPS in order to enjoy one of the better shooters I've played for this series? For me personally, it was certainly worth the effort, even if the final boss makes me want to strangle a kitten. However, before you look into this, please bear in mind a couple of things. First and foremost, there is currently a legal snafu going on between what remains of Parallax and Interplay over the royalties from the game. As a result, the entire Descent series, apart from the new one in Early Access, are not currently available on either GOG or Steam. Finding it shouldn't be hard, as the GOG installer is DRM-free and likely on Pirate Bay, but you'll have to either pirate it or find a used game disc if you really want to play it. Second, for this review, I played the game using the DXX Rebirth mod, which adds support for 1080p and allowed me to use the full functionality of my joystick. I don't normally mod the games which I'm reviewing, as I like to judge it based on the original version, but I felt that it was a worthwhile sacrifice to get overall better video quality. If you're interested in the mod, you can find it in the description below. That's all I have for this video, thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and keep an eye on this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. I'll admit, this one took me longer than I expected to get through than the first, although that's probably because I overloaded myself with a ton of other stuff when I played it. I better go finish up those other things so I can better review the next one. So, I'm gonna get on that, and we'll see you all later.